Hello, Nirvana again, back with part 2 of my video on monster rolls. Last time we covered the lower tier monsters for the most part, also pain elementals, which I guess are a tier 2 mob, and you could argue like cacodemons are a 1.5 or something, but yeah, for the most part it was just the easier things. Now we're getting into the mid tier monsters, which some people may find more interesting. If you're like a slaughter mapper or something, then this is probably going to be a bit more applicable to what you're designing. Um, and also, probably be a bit more detail about these monsters, just because once you get into the mid and high tier stuff, that's where roles are a little bit more defined, maybe, than the low tier stuff, which can often just be sort of like fodder to place around in a lot of ways. So, starting with arachnotrons, bit of a difficult monster to use. They're good as a turret, which is probably one of their primary uses. Good replacement for hit scan if the space is available. The reason they're a good replacement for hit scan is because they have a projectile, right? Um, so there's like a bit more merit to using them in open spaces where there isn't a lot of cover. Because thanks to being able to paint chance them and stuff, you have some ways to actually sort of dodge their projectiles without it being unfair in big wide open spaces. Also good from really long range, like Toilet of the Gods 3, I believe it is. Benjo uses arachnotrons really well, so can look at his maps. I think Down the Drain also uses arachnotrons pretty well. It's something I note about Benjo's stuff quite a bit, because not a lot of people use them, and I'll probably get into why during this, because they are kind of difficult to use. Um, Yeah. Good as a secondary threat. Good at pushing the player from the sides, as their high pain chance makes them susceptible to being killed quickly, locked down if primary threat, right? So like if you got an arachnotron right in front of you and you have a chain gun or a plasma gun or something, they're pretty easy to just pain chance to death because they have an extremely high pain chance, and shooting them is going to stop them from being able to shoot at you. So they're good as like a secondary threat where players going to be focused on one thing and then the arachnotrons are shooting from, behind or the sides or something. So they can actually kind of do damage and be a bit of a pain. In Fracture Worlds Map 2, there's a section where you're forced to run up a staircase to get a rocket launcher because a trap opens up behind you, and then a bunch of imps come out sort of in front of you once you have the rocket launcher, and your focus is shooting them, but there are sort of some faraway arachnotrons that shoot you from the left side as you're dealing with the imps. So if you're not like fully aware of your surroundings, then the arachnotrons kind of put pressure on you from the sides as well, which I felt like was a decent use of them. If you want a more specific example, in slaughter stuff, they're often used for space denial in BFG encounters. Um, they're really big monsters with a huge hitbox, so like the player has to push through them. But like I said, they have high pin chance, so you can kind of get through them. They die fairly easily to the rocket launcher and BFG, so you can kind of push through them relatively easily if you have enough ammo and stuff. Time of Death really likes to use arachnotrons in that way, where he'll have like a giant BFG encounter and then like a huge pack of arachnotrons that you have to push through using the BFG. The other thing is that there's like a bit of a technical element to it because they have such a large kind of janky hitbox, um, that you have to do kind of this in and out kind of movement with the BFG where you push into them to get maximum damage on the pack, and then you have to push away slightly and then move through them again once their kind of hitbox disappears once they're dead. Because if you just run directly into them while BFGing, you tend to get stuck. So there's a bit of like a movement pattern element to using them like that in slaughter encounters. So something to think about, because I mean a lot of movement doom is like momentum preservation. So like you're running and you get to a door, you want to open the door and back up and then run through it so that your momentum kind of continues rather than coming to a full stop. Uh, so similarly to them being a turret from long range, they're good for long range infighting in the sense that because they're kind of a bit of a weaker monster, like against cyber demons and things like that. Um, having them at long distance for infighting purposes can make them survive a little bit longer, and then, uh, you know, if your goal is to have a Cyberdemon get distracted by this Arachnotron for an encounter or something, that can be a more particular use of them. Uh, oh, this is meant to be in the avoid. This is meant to be in the avoid using section, my bad. So we'll get to generally avoid using. A lot of it is to do with space for Arachnotrons, because they are gigantic and they have a very awkward hitbox. So when there isn't enough space, you know, this is the overarching theme with the Arachnotrons. It's why they're difficult to use, because they are 128 by 128, and that's quite a lot of space to occupy for one single monster. You're usually working, unless you're building big sort of scale slaughter maps or big open areas, then a lot of the time, if you're doing indoor stuff, then you're going to be working on spaces that utilize 128 as a size limit due to, you know, doors and things like that. And you're going to be working in sort of increments of that. So making them fit into spaces and be able to move around so they're actually effective without getting stuck is difficult. So avoid using them in areas with steep, small stairs that require large staircases to move up and down. They require really big staircases. I don't actually know off the top of my head how big. It might be 64 width for them to be able to get down, and then probably I would say 8 or 16 for the height. 16 would be your limit. I don't think they will make it down a 24 step. So much like pinkies, but even more difficult to use. Also, they have a tendency to get like stuck really badly. Like if they get pushed at all, uh, it's pretty easy for them to get stuck, like on the sides of staircases and things. If the staircase is like indented into the ground with like railings on the side, or like uh, a raised sector on the side of them. If they're at the top of that staircase and they get knocked onto the side part, they get stuck very quickly. Um, Try to avoid using them in close proximity to the player when there is no access to a good pain chancing weapon. Um, Fairly self-explanatory, but because they actually do a lot of damage. Um, you don't really want to have it in a situation where the player is stuck behind an Arachnotron and they need to push through them and they don't have a weapon that they can pain chance them with, because Arachnotrons will shred you in those situations. Don't just use them with masterminds because they're little baby ones. Try to think about their usage instead. So there's a lot of examples of this that I've used. Don't just use monsters because you've seen them used that way in other things. I mean, you know, again, you can. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's just something you do for fun. But if you're trying to think about balance and making encounters interesting, then try not to just, you know, be like, well, the law is that the Arachnotrons are the masterminds babies. So obviously they have to be together. Um, yeah, generally not a great idea. So, similar to the staircases, try not to put them around line def triggered lifts, because, I mean, line def triggered lifts in general are a bit of a problem if monsters can activate them, because every monster type is going to get stuck on these lifts, but Arachnotrons in particular, and other large monsters, because their hitbox is so big, so it's very easy for them to get stuck. Situations where Val's resurrecting them will be particularly obnoxious, space-wise, unless intentional. Yeah, so, you know, it's just the case that, like, once they get rezzed, um, they might end up sort of like filling up the space very quickly if it's a tight space with the player there. So you don't want like a bunch of Arachnotrons where, unless it's intentional for whatever your encounter is. But yeah, oftentimes that can be a bit of a problem with some large monsters. This goes for mancubuses too, which I'll probably talk about later. But situations where like the player needs to kill a vial, because what happens with archviles when they resurrect things is that the hitbox instantly returns. So if you're firing the rocket launcher and an archvile resurrects an arachnotron or a mancubus, the hitbox will instantly return once the res animation goes off, and then the player's going to blow themselves up with the rocket launcher, for instance. Uh, and it'll happen like instantly, because that on the frame of them getting res is when the hitbox comes back. So just think about that, I guess. Uh, okay. Hell Knights. So probably one of the most used monsters in you know, any WOD really. Slaughter WODs in particular use them a lot because they're great in packs, and in incidental stuff they're also used really commonly because they're a good mid-tier monster with a lot of applications. Um, yeah, so let's get into it, I guess. Good general purpose mid-tier monster when the SSG up, SSG and up is available. So once the player has Super Shotgun, they can be kind of placed around with reckless abandon for the most part because they're easy to deal with. 3 shots for the most part will kill them. They're a good mid-tier monster to use for that. Good as a higher tier enemy once or twice when single shotgun is available. So I'll probably, in the generally avoid using section, I think this is put in there. But when you have a single shotgun, it can be good to have a Hell Knight here and there as something a little more challenging to deal with single shotgun. They're really good in packs with the rocket launcher. This is very common in slaughter stuff. They're satisfying to kill in packs. Good in fighting monster with cybers as they die to splash easily, but they do decent damage. So, um, right, really good in these scenarios because they're a little less likely than Barons to kill a cyber demon. Splash is very effective against them, so cybers can kind of help clean up massive packs of them and like wipe them out pretty easily. Uh, but there is the potential for them to damage the cyber demon as well, which is gonna, bring down the cyber's health and make the encounter kind of clean itself up a little bit for the player. So good pairing generally in slaughter stuff. They're useful as a source of physical pressure in encounters. Slow moving walls admit the force player movement. Happens in Sunlost 20. Happens in Sunlost 30. Fracture Worlds 2. A million billion other WODs, but fights in a slaughter setting where you have, a reasonably tight space and then a lot of Hell Knights teleporting in, usually Barons too. It, it usually ends up being a pretty fun way to utilize them because they're slow moving, but they're relatively high damage, but their projectiles easy to dodge, so it's like a fairly skill-based encounter because if you have this small space and it's getting filled up with these monsters that are moving towards the player slowly, the player has a lot of time to think and play the fight intelligently, but they also have to be kind of mechanically sound because they've got to dodge these projectiles. So the projectile dodging has to be kind of the automatic process in the fight, and then the whole time the player has to be thinking about kind of monster management in terms of moving the monsters around the space and creating like safe spaces and ways to move around the pack by manipulating the AI and stuff. It's probably like one of my favorite encounter types to design because I think there are just a lot of interesting elements to it combat-wise. They're good as a low-threat turret monster, and enlarge packs to create dodgeable walls of projectiles at range. Yeah, so unlike a Revenant who has like homing projectiles and hit scan that you can't dodge, they're kind of a good turret. They're like a higher threat imp as a turret. So if you've got rocket launcher already, they're pretty easy to blink down, but they're also going to do damage if you get hit. And then in terms of the other point, just for slaughter stuff, for the most part, uh, if you have an encounter where you need some sort of range threat from a distance, you can use like Hell Knights and Barons to kind of have projectiles coming at the player consistently throughout the fight to kind of enhance like uh, the pressure that the player's feeling for movement. Like especially if there's like platforming or something, like a big wall of projectiles that's like relatively easy to dodge, but if you're distracted by something else, can do a lot of damage to the player, then that can be like an interesting way to use them. Great for consistently dodgeable projectiles encounters. Yeah, so that applies to like the previous 2 points really. Good as a resurrection threat with archvars. This can apply to more incidental and like smaller encounters or large scale encounters too. Uh, they're good with archviles more so than barons because they have less health, so it's less of an ammo investment. It's less irritating to have them resurrected, and they're also like in smaller areas. They're also like a space threat and stuff, where the player kind of needs them out of the way to continue moving around a space. Um, good for general purpose use in tight encounters. Due to middling health and high damage, yeah. So, to that point, I suppose, just using them in tight encounters is really nice. If the player has like a super shotgun, um, there's a lot of sort of movement manipulation that has to occur if you have a Hell Knight in a really tight space and you've got the SSG. Uh, where you can kind of move into them to get close and then bait the fireball and then dodge away. Things like that where it's just uh, fairly interesting from a combat perspective, even in small amounts. And they don't have like a huge pool of health, which is the really nice thing about them. So it doesn't feel like a grind in these situations. It's like a fairly quick and painless process killing them. But you have to worry about that damage because I think it can range up to 65, something like that for a max damage projectile from Barons and Hell Knights. Um, great for infighting with cybers, yeah. So I talked about that earlier, but I suppose as a more general comment, just good for infighting in general. Having like in slaughter maps, it's common to have sort of mass TPs of Hell Knights and Revenants together, so they will clear each other out and infight during the fight. Uh, they're also good for medium threat berserk encounters, yeah. I think one of the more fun monsters to punch Barons and Hell Knights because they're one of the most consistent in terms of the telegraphing for their projectile and stuff. Like Revenants fire rockets very quickly, although they can be AI manipulated to constantly make them punch from a certain range. But yeah, I personally find punching Hell Knights to be the most fun. Generally avoid using in large amounts when the player's weapons below SSG. Well, to scale it a little bit, honestly, more than two with a single shotgun at once is pretty boring because that's I think what is it, like 6 shots with a single shotgun or something, 6 to 7. So you're looking at 12 shots if there are two of them, which is possible. But once you get more than that, things start to get a little bit boring, I guess. Just plinking down Hell Knights with a single shotgun, and then you don't want like a pack of like 20 Hell Knights that you have to kill with a super shotgun and instead of having rockets, right? So in all cases with monsters, just think about which weapons are most efficient for killing them, and then decide like, uh, do I have too many monsters here for it to be fun for the player to kill them? Like, is it going to be really fucking boring killing 20 Hell Knights with a super shotgun, for instance, or 200 Hell Knights with only a rocket launcher? At that point, you need a BFG. And then it's like, if you need more clearance after that point for slaughter encounters, yeah, here, like in massive amounts in slaughter encounters where they will have to be ground down after the fight. So, like, think about this for slaughter mappers. You have to test your fights to the point where you should be thinking about, is it going to be, is this fight going to have a bunch of grind left at the end where there's no threat? Like, is there a big time period where the player is just running around in a circle rocketing a pack of Hell Knights or whatever, and there's no threat? Because if that's the case, then you need to add in some cyber demons to kind of cull them out, make the fight clean itself up, or you need to strip back, your amounts of monsters, because this kind of cleanup in slaughter encounters is generally just not very fun. Okay, so the Baron of Hell. Similar to the Hell Knight application, but they create a lot more pressure than Hell Knights because they have a lot of health. They have double the amount of health, in fact. Good as a meat shield to stop player hitting high priority targets. So, good for stopping players from being able to kill archviles really easily, for instance. Although I'll talk about that pairing later. But also good, stopping players being able to kill like a turret revenant because of auto aim on the Baron, or chain gunners or whatever it might be. Pain elementals, things like that. Because they're just such a fucking wall of meat. It's like, well, I have to deal with this because it's coming at me and it has a lot of health before I can deal with the other thing. Good as a blocker for teleporters platforms. Yeah, because they have small size and a lot of health. They're the highest health monster outside of the boss monsters. I mean, they used to be a boss in Doom 1, but whatever. Outside of Mastermind and Cyber Demon, they have the most health. And they're small. They fit into most areas the player will fit, so they're useful for blocking like 64 by 64 teleporters and things like that, and still being able to move around if you don't want to just like block it off with a wall, things like that. Good as a way to help the player cut down on grinding down cyber demons, yeah. Barons are pretty much the best monster for killing cybers, so if you have a slaughter encounter where you have a bunch of cyber demons and you need the player to be helped out a little bit with dealing with them, then Baron's generally your go-to for that. And it is something to be wary of, which I think I talk about in the next slide, because there are some situations where you don't want to make that pairing happen. Useful when you want a monster to act as a projectile threat but not be easily or realistically killable, yeah. So in scenarios where you want something similar to the Hell Knight turret mechanic in a fight, but you don't want the player to be able to deal with the threat easily. Because Barons take about 6 rockets, I think. Uh, Potentially more if you get unlucky on damage rolls, so can be like a useful thing for like a very high health turret in certain encounters. And I would say, yeah, to this point about pressure and where I talked about the physical pressure threat, I think pairing Barons in with Hell Knights is something very, it's very specific to those encounters where you have this high pressure moving towards you, and it's a great way to like shift up difficulty settings and stuff. So the more Barons you have, the more difficult a fight like that is going to be, where the physical space pressure is created by the monsters, because the Barons have double the health of a Hell Knight. So for every one Baron you put in, that's equivalent to 2 Hell Knights, but it takes up the space of one. So you've got a lot more HP threat with the same amount of space threat, and they do the same damage and everything. So it means that generally speaking, the player has to shift their priorities a little bit, depending on the situation. Because say you've got a bunch of Hell Knights and Barons taking up your space, it's actually, you think in your head most likely, oh, I gotta kill the Baron, he's higher threat because he has more health. But he actually takes up the same amount of space as one Hell Knight. So realistically, if space is your problem as the player in that fight, you're better off killing the Hell Knights. And Barons in those situations act as a way to stop and block the player from being able to kill the Hell Knights and gain enough space to be able to move around and trivialize the fight. So that combination of just those two monsters, like I was saying, it really has like a lot of interesting kind of combat mechanics to it. So generally avoid using large amounts when the player has rockets below rocket launcher. Even SSG large amounts of barons gets tedious looking at you. Hell Revealed 2. Uh, yeah. Um, Again, it's just the same as the point with the Hell Knights. Like, you don't want to be super shotgunning down like 10 barons. It's a huge amount of time investment killing barons in those situations. So try to use them when you know the player has like the weapons to deal with them efficiently and relatively quickly. Unless obviously, the whole point is that it's going to take you a long time and something else is occurring to make that part of the fight interesting, I suppose. If the player is a single shotgun, looking at you, Hell Revealed 1. Hell Revealed 1 pretty notorious for having some single shotgunning barons. I think Sigil does it a couple of times. It happens. It could work for sure, single shotgunning down a baron. If it's one in a WOD, one in a map or something, not really that big of a deal, but generally try to avoid it because it is like 12 shotgun shots or something. It's quite a long time. Probably going to take you like 20 seconds of just shooting one enemy, which uh, could be made exciting potentially if the space of the room was interesting enough, but if it's just a Baron in a box with a single shotgun, probably not going to be that good. In large amounts paired with vials in tight ammo situations. So the large amounts isn't even really necessarily the problem, but you have to think about how much ammo it takes to kill a Baron and how much time it takes to kill a Baron. And if you're pairing it with a vial, every single time that Baron gets resurrected, that doubles. So if it's 6 rockets, suddenly he gets res. Now you've made the player use up 12 rockets for this one Baron. And in situations where the vials sit behind the Barons and they're just constantly resing, it becomes really tedious very quickly because killing the vials is really difficult, even with rockets, if they're sitting behind walls of Barons. So just consider, always consider the amount of health and ammo, or the amount of time and ammo a player's going to spend dealing with that. Can require careful shooting when paired with cyber demons in fighting, as they have a tendency to get some stuck and kill them, potentially screwing the player on ammo. It's doubly true for masterminds, yeah. Barons will shred masterminds pretty easily, and cyber demons, say you have, I would say, like maybe 4 or more barons in a small space are going to have the potential to kill a cyber demon. They have 1,000 health. They're hitting for up to like 65 or something. And if they get him stuck and they start meleeing him, he's going to die very quickly. And that can completely screw your encounter up if the cyber demon is supposed to live for any amount of time. It's somewhat unavoidable. There's like there's one particular encounter in Fractured Worlds, I think map 5, where I think it can still happen, where the cybers just get, one of the main cybers gets wiped out by 2 barons in a corner while you're distracted or something, and then suddenly you have like a big pack of Hell Knights and barons that you have to deal with. So always think about the fact, oh, I have this many barons. This cyber demon could die, and that could mess up the balance for the rest of the fight. It's definitely something to think about. Alright, Manx. Mancubus is, primarily space denial, at least in slaughter encounters where they're on the floor. That's one of their sort of big merits. They're a high priority range threat, especially in terms of how dodgeable projectiles are. So killing Manx before HKs and imps, their damage is less avoidable. So if you're in, let's say you're in a slaughter encounter, you've got revenants, you've got mancubuses, you've got hell knights. These 3 things, if you're just running around the room, you have like a decent amount of space to work with, and your main threat is the projectiles that are coming at you. Your main threat is always going to be revenants, because the homing projectiles are the ones you have to watch out for the most. Well, it's usually going to be revenants, I should say, depending on the space. And then Manx are going to come next, and the reason for that is that they have less predictably dodgeable projectiles in scenarios where you have a lot of space. because they come out, you know, in volleys of 3 in that set pattern, but when there are multiples of them, that set pattern is going to, you know, they're going to amass a lot of fireballs, and the pattern isn't going to be as easily dodgeable because they're going to be spraying fireballs everywhere, kind of in a cone. And then imps and cacos, etc., Hell Knights, very predictable projectile that just comes in a straight line. So mancubuses are useful in large scale scenarios and in small tight spaces because they can create scenarios where you have threat prioritization based on how dodgeable the projectiles are that's coming at you. Um, so yeah, high tier perch monster angle projectiles generally difficult to dodge, so a good high priority threat. Yeah, bit of a very good turret monster, and uh, again, because of the way that projectiles work, they tend to be a bit more interesting than just sitting like a Hell Knight up somewhere. So yeah, always good in that situation, I think. More dangerous version of arachnotrons for BFG pushing encounters. Yeah, because people underestimate the amount of damage a man can do, but if you get hit by the double blast that comes out, a lot of the time it's just like instant death, especially with low armor. So they're generally a bit more difficult to push into than arachnotrons, depending on the setup of the room and stuff. When you have like BFG and large scale slaughter encounters, so a lot of the time you'll have packs of both or something. And the player will have to like push through one or the other. Like, do I push through the Hell Knights over here? Do I push through the mancubuses? And then, do I want to wipe them out first because they're a higher priority threat in terms of the way their projectiles function in the fight? They're harder to dodge. All of this stuff. So, you know, in terms of designing encounters around these monsters and their roles in them, it's usually thinking about what kind of threat they're going to present the player and what priority they're going to be in fights based on kind of their role that they play. Generally avoid using close quarters where pain chancing isn't viable. So similar to arachnotrons, they can be pain chanced by a chain gun and plasma gun. Bit less likely to be fully pain chanced by the chain gun. Can still get a volley off randomly, so they're a bit more interesting in those situations. But if you don't have a weapon that can pain chance them easily, like you just have a super shotgun and the area is really tight, or you just have a single shotgun or whatever, then it can be a bit of a problem because they are extremely high damage. Don't put them in areas where they don't have space to move. Areas with small steep stairs, they're also pretty bad at getting up and down stairs, although not quite as bad as arachnotrons. I can't remember exactly how big manx are. They may be like 100 by 100 or you know, something like that. They're a little bit smaller than arachnotrons, but they're still quite large, and they don't really like big drops in staircases. Line def triggered lifts, again, bit of a problem for them, and the same with Vials resurrecting them with in areas where their hitbox is going to become a massive problem when they get insta-resed. So just something to think about there. I think Manx are they're generally quite a good monster to use on their own as well, is maybe something that's worth noting. Uh, Even when you have like higher tier weapons, they still present like a decent amount of threat in certain smaller scenarios, so they're quite nice to just sort of put in packs as well in big slaughter fights because yeah, any situation where you can make the players dodging a bit more interesting and their movement a bit more interesting is always good in slaughter stuff, and I think Manx do that really well. Alright, here he is, it's Bernie Boy. Obviously one of the most popular monsters for slaughter encounters, so I think people will sort of want to hear about revenants a little bit. Good as a high threat monster in tight encounters. Pretty self-explanatory there. They have high damage melee, high damage range for their projectile, and because of their homing projectile, they make combat interesting. So in tight encounters, they're obviously very good, just as they are in large scale ones. High threat monster packs versus straight shooting monsters. Uh, this is worded a bit poorly. I don't mean for infighting purposes. I mean compared to. I should probably just write compared to. So yeah, as a way to mix up movement and encounters due to homing projectiles. So these two tie in together. Uh, if you're in a situation where, you know, a lot of the times, a lot of people they might be like, well, I don't really know what to put in this big open room, so I'll put revenants in because they instantly make the movement more interesting because they not only do they have homing projectiles, but they have straight shooting projectiles, which means the player has to be, you know, you have to actually be pretty cognizant when you're fighting a revenant as opposed to a hell knight because you don't know if you're going to get a homing projectile or a straight shooting one. And it means that even when you just have revenants on their own, you have two different kinds of dodging that have to be performed by the player in order for them to stay alive. So usually more interesting for dodging purposes than just Hell Knights on their own or what have you. Useful as a high threat turret. Yeah, so higher threat than Hell Knights and stuff because homing projectiles are more difficult to dodge, especially when they're fired down at an angle. And, infamously, the big 80 damage Rev Rocket is always a big threat. Can come out of nowhere. Useful as high threat berserk combat monster, yeah. So, speedrunners, people who are very good at Doom in general, can manipulate revenants with berserk in order to take basically no damage fighting them because you can go in and punch them and you back up to a certain range and then come back in and punch again and you'll always bait out the melee attack and be able to dodge it consistently. So they can be really nice for berserk combat. Useful for infighting. Similar situation with Hell Knights, they're usually paired together so that the player has like a little bit of leeway in their movement and stuff where they can promote infighting and clear the sort of a section of the fight out without having to sort of kill everything themselves. Good for close quarters encounters with high pan chance weapons. Yeah, so I think plasma gun is probably more applicable here. Chain gun isn't 100% reliable and definitely not for multiple revenants. But revenants are generally pretty good when you have a plasma gun encounter where you want the player to be close in with the monsters and kind of dipping in and out because you get like a 100% pain chance of revenants with the plasma gun. So you can always stop them from attacking you. And it means that you can make kind of crazy pushes with the plasma gun in encounters through packs of revenants and stuff that way. Useful when you acquire monsters that chase the player through tight areas. So remnants and vials have pretty much the same dimensions as the player, which is probably one of the main reasons they're used in slaughter stuff a lot. And it makes them really good for incidental combat too, when you have a lot of tight areas that are built for the player. It's probably why you see them a lot as well, because potentially you have people who are building maps and then doing thing placement after the fact, and they realize like, oh shit, I need a monster that can follow the player through this area because I've built it for the player and not really for monsters so much. And revenants can very easily follow the player around maps, so usually they're good to use in most scenarios for that reason. Good as SSG fodder in incidental areas and rocket launcher fodder in medium packs. And then, for BFG fights later. Again, self-explanatory. Revenants have pretty low health. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but lower than a Hell Knight. They take, generally speaking, 2 SSG shots, sometimes more. So they're great for SSG gameplay, and they're really good for rocket gameplay because A, Splash is very effective against them because they're fairly low health. B, they tend to get pain chance by the rocket launcher, which is rare for monsters in general, it seems, a lot of the time. Actually, that's not true. Monsters, a lot of other monsters do get page outs by it, but it means that you can kind of stop groups of revenants from being able to constantly fire rockets at you with the rocket launcher, and they're satisfying to kill with the rocket launcher, which is really important. I mean, I think one of the reasons Doom is so popular is just that the sound design makes combat really satisfying, and it makes killing big packs of monsters really satisfying, and revenants are no exception. Great in large packs in hallways or on stairs as a way to force the player into strategic movement patterns. Yeah, I mean the main thing with revenants is that they force the player. You can't, if they're in a sort of scenario in a hallway sort of shaped room with revenants in front of them, the fact that you have to crash revenant rockets into the wall to get rid of them because they're homing often means you have to do this sort of figure eight pattern dodging, and then you might do like a half U dodge into curling back and slapping the rockets into the wall to stop them from chasing you, and then you have to keep continually moving. So the player has to like use their brain, and they also have to use their mechanics at the same time when fighting revenants. And if you're on stairs, obviously the angle's really awkward, and you've got to crash rockets vertically a lot of the time. Um, like pull the rockets down and then crash them into the wall, or pull them into the stairs that you're running down, and things like that. And the bumpiness of the stairs can make it difficult to dodge the rockets. So revenants are just really useful in general for when you want to mix up player movement and force the player into uncomfortable patterns for dodging, so that they actually have to use their brain a little bit, which I'm a big advocate for in Doom. Generally avoid using in areas with low ceilings. 64 as their sprites will clip. Revenants are taller. Their sprite, same with Archviles, both of them. Their sprites are taller than their actual hitbox. So you can put a Revenant in, I want to say, I think they're 56 high, like the player. But maybe it's 64. But if you put them into a 56 or 64 height room, their sprite will actually clip into the ceiling, and it looks really terrible. So don't use them that way. I think you probably want like 96 height or something, potentially, or maybe 80 height or something for their sprite. Try not to use them in areas where homing projectiles are impossible to crash into a surface, unless intentional. Obviously, some fights are built deliberately this way in order to be challenging, which is totally fine. But again, most of these points are just like, try to always consider this when you're using the enemy in these scenarios. So it's oftentimes you want to make sure there's something to crash the Revenant rockets into if you're trying to sort of balance a fight. Or it can be a good way to kind of lower difficulty in an area if you're noticing that the player is struggling to kind of crash the projectiles into anything. The secret fight in the final map of Fractured Worlds, I added in extra pillars to make it so that it was easier for the player to crash the rockets into them, because that fight was like a little bit overtuned. So that was one way that I balanced that fight. Impacts on the player's weapons lower than SSG, yeah. Even, once again, how much time does the player need to spend? How much HP does the thing have? How much ammo is the player going to have to use? Just think about these things when you're designing encounters. Is it fun, or is it just time consuming and grinding for the player to kill 16 revenants with the super shotgun, 5 revenants with a single shotgun, 40 revenants with the rocket launcher? It could be fun if the scenario you set up for the combat is enjoyable enough. But just think, is it actually fun when you're playtesting and stuff? Also, don't use them just because you can't think of anything else to put in a sorter encounter. Again, this is just one of those things of like, actually try to think about why you're using a monster instead of just placing it in because revenants are good in slaughter, or whatever the case. Alright, Spider Mastermind. Probably the single most difficult monster to use in Doom in an interesting way. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So, what are they good for? They're a high priority target. One of the highest priority targets because if they're in an open area, they do an insane amount of damage if they're allowed to. Um, so more high priority than a cyber demon would be. For instance, like say you have BFG in both these scenarios, you've got a mastermind in a big open area, cyber demon in a big open area. You obviously go for the spider mastermind first because it's going to shred you in the open. Massive space denial area blocker, like Baron on a larger scale, or like Arachnotron on a larger scale, whatever. Um, but in this case, I was more talking about the concept of blocking off progression. So if you want to stop the player from moving through somewhere, then obviously the Spider Mastermind is can be useful for that. In fight off large packs of small monsters, so they can be pretty good at killing like large groups of imps or other hit scanners or whatever. Depending on your placement of them, often has to be more in a turret function because they tend to get stuck pretty easily, which I'll talk about. Useful specifically as an aggro drawer for monsters to keep pressure off the player. So a lot of the time when I use masterminds, I'll use them as here's a big monster with a lot of HP, and maybe there's like a lot of other difficult monsters in the area. But as the player, you can use the mastermind to kind of draw the aggro of everything else because of how much the bullets kind of spread around the area and how easily it is for them to draw aggro. So that is one way to utilize them in an interesting way. They can also function as living cover from enemies, yeah. So, because they're so big and their hitbox is actually even bigger than their actual body, it's 256 by 256, which is absolutely massive. Um, you can use them in ways where they can maybe draw aggro for the player, or they're gonna get hit, and the player can like just stand behind the mastermind and let them tank everything for a while to either give the player some time to think, or maybe get some health, or pick up ammo, or whatever it is, um, or maybe in the hope that it's actually gonna weaken some stuff. So yeah, that is a possible way to use them. I would say I didn't put this on here, but if you want to look at really good encounters with masterminds, Danny Babinga uses them really well in Combat Shock 2, and some of his Sunless maps. Stardate 2066 has a really good Mastermind encounter. I can't remember the map though. And Miasma has a really good Mastermind encounter. I would say that they're best used as an aggro drawer, where the player kind of needs space, and they need the Mastermind's ability to draw aggro to give them space. So large Miasma, for instance, is 2 large packs of Hell Knights and Barons on either side, Mastermind in the middle. You have to pull the monsters out to get them hit by the Mastermind, so that she will draw aggro, and pull those monsters away, and that gives you enough space to move around the fight and start culling the Hell Knights and Barons, right? Really smart way to use a Mastermind. I think Tourniquet uses them pretty well in general in his stuff as well. So I would say, yeah, that sort of their main interesting factor as an enemy is that they are really good at drawing aggro, and unlike other hit scan enemies like chain gunners, they have enough health that aggro drawing actually gives the player some time to kind of achieve something in a fight. And as a high threat turret as well. Danny Babinga likes to use them as turrets sometimes in a lot of his fights, and the reason that you want to use them as turrets, even in scenarios where you wouldn't normally want to place a turret, is because they get stuck super fucking easily and they die really quickly if they're on ground level with the stuff that they're infighting with. So putting them as a turret for infighting actually makes them survive a lot longer and makes them actually sort of achieve something. So avoid using, very similar to arachnotron and mancubus, but on a much bigger scale. So don't use them in areas with small steps. Don't use them in areas where they don't have space to move or around line def triggering lifts, especially for masterminds. Line def triggering lifts are horrible because their hitbox is so much bigger than they are. They get stuck. If even the tiniest part of its hitbox is on the lift, it's going to get stuck. They get stuck incredibly easily. Don't put them in just to infight another mastermind. See this shit all the fucking time. Don't put it in just to infight with a Cyberdemon. We've played map 20 of Doom 2. It was sick when I was like fucking 10 years old or whatever. Loved it. Greatest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. But don't just, put a mastermind in to kill another mastermind because it's been done 100 times. Map 28 of Doom 2. Holy shit, 2 masterminds. Unbelievable. They're fighting. This is crazy. Just think about why you're putting monsters into spaces, I guess. Just because there are arachnotrons and they need their mum. Similar scenario. Arachnotrons don't need their mum, okay? They're adults. Stop coddling them. Don't put them in areas with poor cover. Same situation as chain gunners, except on steroids. If you put a mastermind in an area without cover, they're going to absolutely destroy the player. And, one of the reasons why masterminds are so weirdly balanced in the first place, why they have less health than cyberdemons, is because when they tested Doom 1, they tested at pistol starts. So Dis, you don't have BFG or anything for Dis. I think you get a plasma gun, maybe rockets or something. And in the space that you have, it was a real pain in the ass to kill this thing because it just shredded you with the stuff that you were given pistol starts in Dis. So, think about how much damage they actually do. Don't use them as meat to grind through, especially with rockets, as they don't take splash damage. Maybe some people don't know this, but it's not just cyberdemons that don't take splash damage. It's things with the boss flag, which includes masterminds. They also don't take splash damage from rockets, so don't just put masterminds in as like, I need to take up the player's time a little bit. Here's a mastermind, and then they have to sit there and shoot plasma into it for 20 minutes, or SSG it down, or worst case scenario, fire rockets into it. Don't put them in the middle of large packs of monsters because they just get stuck and they die. They will legitimately die to one pinky. This is not a joke. They're completely fucking useless in those situations. Entropy has a fight with a bunch of imps and a mastermind, which there were times where he would just die to one imp. It still happens in the map. And if you're just going to put masterminds on the ground, you need to think about the fact that he's probably going to die if the monsters are able to get close to it. So try to consider like placement of masterminds very carefully before you use them in encounters if you don't want them to just die immediately and do nothing. Also, don't use them as a long-range sniper unless they're going to get crushed. Combat Shock has some relatively long-range sniper ones, but they get crushed later in the map. And they're utilized like for a couple of different fights, so they use it in an interesting way. So it's doable, but you don't want to be grinding them down after the fact from long range, because boy is that boring. Okay, it's time. It's time for the Archvile. Everyone's favorite monster, / everyone's most hated monster. Obviously, I love them. Probably the most interesting monster in Doom in terms of mechanically. Nothing in other games really behaves like Archviles. They have a lot of interesting niche little mechanics to them. So yeah. High priority threat, generally highest priority threat depending on encounter. So between Vials, Pain Elementals, Cyberdemons, and maybe Masterminds, they're probably, your biggest threats in encounters. Like you pretty much always want to kill the Vials first because of the way their targeting works. They're good as a specific targeted long to mid-range turret, yeah. Well, it could be a short-range turret, doesn't really matter either way. But basically by turret here, I mean placing them up on a high up spot where they're not going to be running around. They're stationary. They hit the player as if they were a turret here. They're really good for that in specific scenarios, especially, you know, where the player has to mess around with their targeting range. Because you know, they have a certain range from within, from like where they can actually attack the player. So using them as a turret in scenarios where the player has to manage the amount of space they have, and then versus like, okay, well if I go into this area, this file can now target me. So they can be a really effective turret for that. Sunlost 30 Final Fight is a good example of that. Area denial, again, this ties into them as turrets and things, but you know, in cages, wherever, somewhere where they're kind of more stationary, and they're put there just to deny that area from the player unless the player manages to kind of wipe them out, or in extremely high amounts to just sort of kill the player if they go into that space. Good as high pressure in areas with cover, yeah. It's pretty much the most common use for them. You've got a pillar in a room, it's like, oh shit, I can put an archvile in here now. But you know, be careful with that, obviously. But areas with like a lot of cover, vials are always like really good because, again, it's about making the player's sort of movement and combat interesting. And you see that fire on your screen, suddenly you have to sort of think, where is my cover? And that whole sort of back and forth is why archviles are kind of interesting in the first place. Useful for vial jump gimmicks and secrets, so a bit more of a niche application, but they can actually bounce the player, so you can utilize them for vial jumps and things like that. Good for resurrection specifically, repopulate areas, keep threat levels at a constant until they're killed. This is part of why they're super high priority, because they resurrect other monsters, so situations like, you know, Secret Fight of Sunless 28, where tons of vials running around the area and there's a billion other monsters, and you have to sort of dip in and kill vials, pick each vial off before you can kind of deal with the rest of the pack. Because they're going to resurrect everything, and because of the way their targeting works, so they're really useful in tandem with big packs of other monsters as a resurrection threat. Good as a singular threat in small encounters or incidentally, yeah. One of the best for just a singular encounter with a monster, like player has a super shotgun, player has a rocket launcher, whatever. Vials are great to just kind of put in as a nice little surprise for the player to deal with. And, you know, there aren't a lot of monsters that are interesting to fight on their own in Doom. So, you know, Vials, Cyber Demons, Mancubuses sometimes, you know, occasionally Barons and Revenants, things like that. But once you get into higher tier weapons, Archviles pretty much remain instantly interesting on their own in all situations, all the way up to the BFG if ammo is tight. So, one of the best singular threat monsters for sure. Useful in certain situations where you want a monster that can follow the player, so same point as the Revenant, I talked about this already. They're small and they're fast. They can follow the player better than any other monster in the game because of their speed. So pretty much always threatening no matter what. Oh, this was meant to be in generally avoid. My bad. That was the same point as with the Revenants where they sprite tends to clip. Good for areas where infighting may cause issues, so if you have a scenario where you want a group of monsters but you don't want, maybe you got a Cyber Demon but you don't want the Cyber Demon to wipe out all the other monsters that are in the area, but you want something in the space with it. Vials are good because even though they're going to infight, the Cyber Demons aren't going to kill them instantly. And if you accidentally hit them, then they instantly become a threat again because they have such quick target acquisition. So when to avoid using archviles. Let me just put the, let me just fix that up. So 11? I don't fucking know. There, it's way too small. 14. Sounds great. Don't put them in areas with low cover, yeah. Don't just have vials running around where there's no cover. Unless you know, again, if there's intentionality, sure. But vials without cover is generally just pretty shit for gameplay because they can always hit you. They hit you across rooms. If you accidentally hit one of them, they have infinite height. Sorry, they have infinite range on their attack. So yeah, maybe that should be a more specific example too. You don't want to put them in situations where um, you have a lot of monsters that you have to kill with BFG, and the splash from BFG, the traces, are going to hit the vials and give them infinite range, unless that's a specific part of the encounter. Because you don't want a situation where the player needs to wipe out a big pack of monsters, but they're just going to take damage from these vials in the distance because their traces are hitting them and giving them range that they shouldn't have, kind of thing. So think about that too. Um, don't add them in after the fact as a way to increase threat in an encounter. I mean, you can do this, obviously, but don't do this without thinking about it. Don't just like drop archviles into scenarios where they may not actually be applicable or fun to fight. I see this quite a bit, I feel like, where sort of vials have clearly just been added in as like a ground threat at the end, and they tend to be like really imbalanced and obnoxious to deal with. In ground threats in large spaces with little cover. This is a massive one for a lot of newer slaughter people. Just putting archviles that like run around in gigantic open spaces without cover to get away from the shots is not very interesting gameplay wise, and it definitely feels like a cheap way to increase difficulty. Um, yeah, I mean that's all really. It makes BFGing frustrating because of the traces potentially hitting them accidentally, and you getting just blasted out of nowhere with no real recourse if there isn't the cover to get away from it. Um, and sometimes if you're BFGing large packs of monsters and you hit a vial, you could be hitting it while it's already in fighting something else and it's in the middle of an attack animation and you get insta blasted because of it. Um, so just try to think about, is it viable to use archviles here as a ground threat where they're just running around? Or should I be using them like as a turret here? Or should I be using them not at all? Sometimes you don't need to use archviles in slaughter encounters. Don't just put them in every single encounter. It's not necessary. Um, don't use them to repopulate areas to force the player to kill the same monsters again. Don't just have them like teleported to a room where the player's just killed 1,000 Cacodemons and Hell Knights just to repopulate the area because you think like, oh well, this will extend. Here's like a whole new fight with just some extra archviles added in because generally speaking, players don't want to kill the same monsters they've just killed all over again. It can obviously be used in an interesting way, but I think most people are kind of tired of that trope and don't really want to kill the same monsters over and over again. So, yeah. Don't use them in areas where players likely to get bounced into softlocks unintentionally. Again, just something to think about. Um, you always want to be aware of the fact that an archvile can bounce the player over certain, you know, they can bounce them over a 32 high wall, they can bounce over a 64 high wall. You just want to think about the fact that, okay, this area needs to be viable for archvile placement, because if the player gets bounced over these railings, what happens is they're soft locked and they have to reload their save, or they get bounced into this nukage and it kills them, which is totally fine. That could be part of your encounter, but just think about it beforehand. That the player is pretty likely to get absolutely whomped out of the battlefield. Behind groups of monsters where they're still in range to hit the player and there's minimal cover. So don't put a big wall of barons and then 5 archvials behind them in a small space where the vials have range, and you can't hit the vials because they're behind a big bunch of barons, unless you've actually designed the encounter around that, and there's, ample cover and ways to pull the barons away and ways to get the vials to come out so you can kill them. Don't just like sit vials in areas where they can't be hit and they can hit you, because their projectile works in a way in which they can always hit you and you can't always hit them. In areas with low ceilings, yeah, so sprite clip thing. They also tend to clip through walls because of their sprite is actually like quite wide compared to what they will fit into, and you could often see their hands kind of clipping through walls and stuff, so just be aware of that if they're in like a 64 by 64 box or something. Okay, the big boy. Everyone's fave, Cyberdemon. So, what are they good for? High threat monster, obviously. One of the best as a solo encounter, which I have here, depending on weapons available. They are good for SSG fights, for harder encounters. They're good for plasma gun, they're good for BFG. Uh, they're great for specifically for two-shot encounters with the BFG, pressuring the player to use specific mechanics to win encounters. So if you're making something challenging, like you're making a challenge map or a slaughter map, and you're like, I want my players to be good enough that they can two-shot. Now you've got kind of a skill barrier for entry into this encounter, which people might say is a little gatekeepy or whatever, but maybe on lower difficulty settings you don't have that. So maybe on ultra violence it's a two-shot fight, whatever the case. The fact that you have this two-shot mechanic as a factor with cyber demons makes them really interesting for singular encounters in like challenging maps, because you're just you're introducing this interesting mechanic into your fight instantly by just placing them in a BFG with 80 cells. They are the ultimate infighter, the goat of infighting, if you will. They're great with large packs of barons, hell knights, revenants, manx, arachnotrons, everything. Huge packs of imps. They're, you know, they use in slaughter maps so frequently for a reason, because once you get to a certain point in playing a lot of Doom, you start to realize that Doom is a lot more about sort of like the cyber demon isn't like always a big boss monster with a lot of health, or it's a really hard monster or whatever. He plays a certain role in an encounter. He plays the role of infighter for the most part, right? In a lot of these slaughter scenarios, and executing an encounter with that role in mind is what people who make these slaughter and challenge maps is sort of, that's what they're trying to accomplish. So utilizing them with big packs of other monsters for clearance and infighting is a super good way to use them. Here I said clearance as well, yeah. Clearing out packs of weak monsters, imps, hit scanners, pinkies for space. I don't think I have it written here, but more importantly, in terms of infighting, they're good at helping the player. They're a tool for the player to utilize. It's not just another big threat target put into a fight. It's like, okay, well, I can actually use this monster to help me clear out this big pack of monsters. And in saying that, they also help to speed up encounters. You might actually add cyber demons into a slaughter encounter in order to make it easier rather than more difficult, because you've got 100 barons of hell that the player has to kill. All of a sudden you add 5 cyber demons in. They're going to take a bunch of damage from the barons, and they're going to kill a bunch of the barons, which is going to make the fight a lot faster and a lot easier and a lot cleaner for the player. So they're sort of fairly unique in that regard, that they can make fights way easier or way more difficult depending on how they're utilized. They're an incredibly versatile enemy. Pretty much only limited by like their size and large HP pool, which their HP pool is why Rubik's sort of 1000 health Magnolia cyber demons that I use in Fraction Worlds, why they're so useful, because they kind of mitigate that massive HP pool problem. Um, works as a high threat turret either at close or at range. Yeah, they're good as a high threat turret in terms of good as a turret for infighting, um, firing from range, and the player having to lead monsters into the path of the rockets. They're great for that. But can also be good in a stationary position where the player has to fight them at an awkward angle, because downward firing rockets are more difficult to dodge than just head-on ones. Good for area and space denial, blocking off areas due to threat level and HP, so similar to masterminds, but potentially a lot more dangerous. So it's like forcing the player to deal with this threat or forcing them to kind of run by. Good for delayed threat from faraway rockets, yeah, so extremely large scale slaughter encounters, you might use cyber demons to have kind of a ranged encounter where there's a delay between when the cyber demons start firing and when you have to dodge the rockets. So you might have like platforming with cyber demon rockets coming at you, and you've got to kind of dodge the rockets as they come in. Yeah, I mean there are a lot of more scenarios, like a lot more specific scenarios I could probably get into regarding when it's good to use cyber demons. Like I said, they're a pretty versatile monster considering how much health they have. Um, and they can be used in a billion different ways, as sort of slaughter words over the years have shown, and other words too. I think in incidental stuff they usually utilize more as a singular encounter, uh, and they're really good for that too, or as like a duo. That's a common encounter in incidental stuff, is having the sort of the cyber demon duo. And it generally works pretty well, but there should be some amount of combination within fighting and stuff. Generally avoid areas where, generally avoid using them in areas where splash is unavoidable and health is low. Super tight spaces, yeah. Again, um, if that's your intention, sure. If that's sort of what you've thought about, but if you've just plopped the cyber demon down and it sort of turns out that the splash is kind of completely unavoidable and the player's just going to be taking chip damage the whole time, that can be pretty obnoxious. Don't use them when the player only has a rocket launcher just because of E2M8. Please stop. Please. Some people don't mind it, I guess, where you kill the cyber demon with the rocket launcher, but personally, I absolutely hate it. It takes like 50 rockets. It's so boring. They never pain chance. Stop, in my opinion. But go ahead if you really want to. But also stop. When the player has anything less than SSG, I mean, should be pretty self-explanatory. Don't make me use 400 bullets with the chain gun to kill a cyber demon, unless it's a Nirvana or something. Um, yeah. Or if there's a crusher. If there's a crusher, then go for it. If they're inaccessible, require lots of ammo to spam down. Use crushers to kill far off turret cybers. Yeah. Don't just like put a turret cyber out in the middle of nowhere that's shooting at you that can't be killed at all. Uh, you know, for UV max purposes and also just general gameplay purposes. Kind of boring to kill from that distance. At the top of stairs, if the player has little space to move, again, unless intentional. Angled cyber demon rockets are really obnoxious a lot of the time. Can be fun to dodge, but always think about the fact that if the player is on a downward angle, the rockets will be fired down at that angle, and it can be super painful if they block you from coming up the stairs and progressing at all because of that. And yeah, similarly, pressure on platforms with the angle of their rockets is obnoxious to dodge unless intentional. Again, can be fun. Certain scenarios where the angle is just really stupid and maybe you don't have the proper guns to kind of deal with it, and it can be annoying. In areas where they get stuck by being pushed, BFG is usually the main one. But if they're on a platform that doesn't have blocking lines, they can very easily get pushed by the BFG ball and get stuck. So, you know, for all monsters, think about monster blocking lines if they're going to be turrets, and think about whether they can get stuck on a staircase or something just by being pushed in boom and stuff like that. Ports where monsters get pushed like that, because not so much of an issue in vanilla, where they, well, no, it is an issue in vanilla, right? But they don't drop off ledges. Yeah. Also, I would say just a general rule, as I've been talking about like a million times in this, I think it's most applicable to the Cyber Demon. Always think about how much health do they have, and you know, how much time is the player gonna have to spend killing them, and how much ammo are they gonna have to use killing the Cyber Demon. Think about the fact that if a player has the plasma gun, that is 200 plasma that they have to fire into a Cyber Demon. Totally fine to have killing a Cyber Demon with a plasma gun, but just think about how much ammo it takes to kill a Cyber Demon. It has 4,000 health, and how much time it takes to kill a Cyber Demon. And then think about, is this going to be fun? Have I made the space fun enough to compensate for the amount of time it's going to take? Is there enough movement going on? Like Swim with the Whales map 2, for instance, has that double Cyber Demon fight, but they're flying around on conveyors the whole time, they're teleporting around. There's a lot going on, so the player isn't really thinking about, oh, I'm just firing my plasma gun in a straight line. They're using their brain and they're thinking, I gotta dodge this, I gotta move over here, I gotta, you know, there's a lot going on that they're reacting to in that fight. So it's not just kind of standing still, just firing plasma in a straight line. So just, yeah, always think about that with Cyber Demon specifically. That's probably like a main point to consider with anything, but Cyber Demons are the big one. Yeah. I'm sure I've missed a lot of things with monster roles, like discussing sort of how to utilize them, and I'm sure there are sort of other scenarios I've forgotten that you probably shouldn't use them in. But this is what I came up with, I guess, in terms of thinking about how to utilize monsters and the kind of things that I like to think about when I'm sort of placing monsters into a space. And like I said in the encounter design video, a lot of it comes down to just placing monsters down into a space and then watching and feeling how they move around and how they react to stuff and how they work with the structures that you've built. So just make sure you're always doing that. And, you know, Iconosin and Wolfenstein SS I've just written no here. But the reason for this, Iconosin fights nearly always terrible. And I mean, that's really all I'm going to say about it. Maybe you'll come up with a good one. Maybe you'll be the guy where I'm like, you'll be the person who comes up with the sickest Icon of Sin fight that's ever been constructed, and I'm going to change my mind completely. But I doubt it, because every single one I've played has been pretty bad. Wolfenstein SS, they just don't fit in with the aesthetic very well of Doom, and they're missing frames because they're from Wolfenstein 3D. So they're generally just not used. If you're kind of new to the Doom community and you're making maps and stuff, people you avoid using them for those reasons. They're missing frames on their shooting animations, so they always face the player while they're shooting, and they just look shittier than every other monster because of that. And yeah, thematically, they don't really make sense. So just be aware of that, I guess. That's the reason people don't use them. Doesn't mean you can't use them. You can if you want to, but can be a bit jarring for people. So yeah. But anyway, I think that wraps it up. I've covered every monster now in these two videos. Hopefully this was useful. Obviously a little bit rambling, as is my way when I try to explain these types of things. But you know, as usual, I'll put the slides in the description of the video, and Hopefully it's going to help some people when they're sort of designing maps and trying to think about monster placement and stuff. Next video I think will be on aesthetics for maps, and then after that I have some other ideas. So yeah, we'll see. But thanks for watching, and I guess I'll see you in the next video. Yeah, peace out.